Hey everybody, it's Jason with Parallel Reality coming back with you today with an article from the Daily Wire dated August 27th, and it says, how the UN's Famine Authority engaged in data fraud to undermine U.S. humanitarian aid. And this, of course, is the Israel-Gaza conflict again, because they decided to say there was a famine. It turns out, of course, like everything coming out of there from the UN or the Gaza Health Ministry, it was a lie. Subheadline here says, a famine of facts, UN declaration distorts reality with bad science, analysis finds. Not cutting that cough out, but sorry about that. So let's get into it. It says, on August 22nd, the United Nations declared that famine was currently occurring in Gaza City. Within hours, the claim drove headlines, advocacy, and legal filings. All of it based on flawed science. A forensic review of the data by our team at the Network Contagion Research Institute found that the declaration leaned on flimsy modeling and buried evidence. That matters because the declaration undercuts a U.S.-backed aid model that is actually delivering. It says, with confidence in international institutions eroding, the United States launched a new experiment in humanitarian aid. Working through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, with State Department support, this model represents the first serious alternative to the UN's decades-old aid machinery. It says early evidence suggested it was working. Food reached people more reliably, nutrition outcomes improved, and distribution was more predictable. That all changed when the UN's Famine Authority, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC, so all that just stands for only IPC, okay, they declared a famine in Gaza City. The announcement instantly shaped headlines, influencers, and legal forums. Sorry about that again, not cutting it out again. But behind the language of science was something else entirely. Manipulated modeling, buried evidence, and a systemic effort to discredit the new U.S.-led approach that was actually working. This was not a mistake. It was a set of choices, and every choice cut in the same direction, toward alarmism, toward distortion, and away from the success of American leadership. And of course, when it's coming from the UN, it's always going to go against Israel and for the Palestinians. Just always. This is a case study in statistical malpractice. I almost said medical malpractice. Got ahead of myself. It's statistical malpractice. It says the UN Famine Authority's declaration rests most centrally on a claim that child malnutrition in Gaza was increasing exponentially. This was not a side note. It was the foundation of the UN Famine Authority's entire argument that famine was not only happening, but already locked into a death spiral. The projections of catastrophe and the justification for the world's response hinged on that exponential model. But the model was a scatter plot of just 6 data points with a trend line fit by an Excel spreadsheet regression function. Any introductory statistics class warns against fitting exponentials to tiny samples. The first point sat out of line with the second in a way that can create the illusion of acceleration. There is more. The UN-backed analysts did not tell readers that a plain linear model explained the same 6 points just as well. They did not share the fit statistics that would let others judge. They did not present alternative trend lines. And they did not acknowledge that a larger, updated data set of more than 15,000 children, available 2 weeks before publication, broke the exponential story entirely. It says not only this, but the fresh data disproved the UN Famine Authority's central allegation. Their famine declaration rested on the claim that child malnutrition had surged beyond the 15% threshold required to trigger a famine classification. Yet the updated data set the rate at 13.5%. By the UN Famine Authority's own standard, famine had not been reached. To repeat, the UN's adopted famine threshold was not met, and their own data source proved it. Yeah, funny how they have to keep fudging the numbers just to make Israel look bad. So let's be clear. At each step, the United Nations Famine Authority made a decision. First bullet says they chose to fit an exponential model to 6 data points, a textbook statistical error. Second bullet says they chose to hide the fact that a less incriminating linear model fit the data just as well. Third bullet, they chose to ignore updated data from a far larger sample that contradicted explosive growth of famine. And fourth bullet says they chose to declare famine even though their own updated data showed child malnutrition at 13.5% below the 15% threshold required by their own standard. It says these are not neutral omissions. These are consistent directional decisions. And that direction points squarely at undermining evidence of improvement, especially improvement linked to U.S.-backed aid. So the next section here is buried evidence and a double standard. So statistical modeling was not the only method manipulated. In July, the UN's Famine Authority commissioned 2 hunger surveys in Gaza. One found that 73% of households suffered severe or very severe hunger. The other, conducted at the same time, found that number to be just 21%. Both were described as representative. Only the more extreme figure appeared in the final report. The other was buried in a back annex. So I like how you get two completely different answers on this thing, and they went with, no, let's just use the one that makes Israel look worse. Because even where the numbers were similar between governorates, the classification shifted without explanation. Gaza governorate and Deir al-Balah returned nearly identical scores. One was labeled famine, the other was 2 full phases lower. And then there is Rafah, the epicenter of Gaza humanitarian fund distribution. It is also the region with the most stable nutrition outcomes. The UN Famine Authority excluded it entirely from its analysis, claiming it had been depopulated. Yet in prior reports, Rafah was included without issue. Was this about unavailable data, or was it about removing inconvenient results? I'm going to take a wild guess at that one and say inconvenient results, but let's keep reading. So next section here says attacking what works. So according to the UN Famine Authority's own report, recipients of GF aid were better nourished. They averaged 1,700 kilocalories per day, hundreds more than those relying on other sources. Meanwhile, violence around GHF distribution sites fell by more than 25% between June and August. Well, that's good, because that's not an easy job. It's a very dangerous job. But rather than highlight those results, the UN's Famine Authority dismissed GHF's efforts outright. They said the aid did not meet their internal definition of humanitarian assistance, which I'm wondering what that could possibly be. It says Reverend Johnny Moore, the head of the GHF, said the results of his group's efforts can't be dismissed. It says where GHF distributions operate, nutrition outcomes improve and violence now decreases, Moore says. Any responsible body should recognize and reinforce these results, not dismiss them. If the international community truly wants to help, it must build on what works rather than undermine it. As the UN's Famine Authority did not just dismiss these gains. They erased them, they redrew the map, suppressed the results, and changed the rules, which all happened to preserve a narrative that painted American-led aid as irrelevant or worse. Next section says, a sabotage of American legitimacy. It says, in Gaza, U.S. leadership has taken the form of a new evidence-based model of humanitarian aid and, in this context, the systemic, substantiated accusations take on the appearance of a coordinated attempt to delegitimize a rival approach. The UN Famine Authority based its mortality estimates on Hamas-controlled data. Yeah, there's a problem. The people that lie about everything, no, suddenly they're telling the truth. Yeah, I'm going to press X to doubt on that. Does it fail to disclose forecasting errors? It buried evidence of U.S. progress. It downgraded one region and inflated another despite similar conditions. Even within the UN Famine Authority's global record, Gaza stands out. In NCRI's independent audit of their forecast accuracy across 8 countries, Gaza was the worst overprojection NCRI could detect in the records on their website. 80% of subregions were misclassified at a higher level than what actually occurred. That fact was never disclosed publicly. It had to be reconstructed from raw data. And next section says the truth is the first casualty. It says every decision made by the UN Famine Authority in this process, every model they selected, every figure they buried, every area they excluded, had the effect of obscuring evidence that U.S.-backed aid programs were showing positive results. This was not a transparent application of data science. The choices made function less as neutral analysis and more as narrative shaping. The UN Famine Authority's report seemingly attempted to obscure evidence that U.S.-backed aid programs were delivering food more effectively, contributing to improved nutrition outcomes, reduced violence, and greater predictability in distribution. If a small data science organization based in New Jersey can identify systemic irregularities at the core of the UN Famine Authority's assessments, there is strong reason to call for a deeper, independent investigation. Congress, the State Department, and external watchdogs should review how the UN and its affiliates produce findings that diverge from their own data and thresholds, and why contradictory evidence was excluded or downplayed. The implications go beyond Gaza. If a UN agency can misclassify famine through methodological or reporting failures, confidence in global humanitarian assessments is at risk. An investigation is essential to safeguard the integrity of humanitarian science and restore trust in international reporting. It's the same thing with what happened with a certain flu-like disease that happened a few years ago, is that people were lying about stuff and saying, the cure for that was going to cure you, and it didn't, and made things a lot worse. And, of course, people don't really trust the science because of it. So that's what you get when you lie about things. People just start to not trust you. That's just human nature, folks. So, of course, everything here went against Israel and was pro the Palestinian narrative because the UN is biased. But what do you think about this? Does this piss you off a little bit? Because it certainly pisses me off a little bit. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.